Hello, everyone. So to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to start at the top of the hour. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Region 7 Science Programs webinar series. My name is Eleodora Chamberlain, and I'm the Region 7 Science Liaison. The Regional Science Program is pleased to have Dr. Jeremy Michalek to talk about their research project on plug-in electric vehicles and the potential for helping to mitigate climate change and reduce health damages from air pollution when charged with clean power sources. Dr. Michalek is a professor of engineering and public policy, professor of mechanical engineering, and a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. He also directs the Vehicle Electrification Group, which studies technical, economic, environmental, social, behavioral, logistical, and policy dimensions of electric vehicles and other transportation trends like ride-hailing. He has given policy briefings and public comments based on his research at state and federal levels, and his work is frequently cited in media outlets ranging from the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, to NPR and the New York Times. So today, he is presenting on an ORD STAR grant project, Electrical Vehicle Adoption Potential and Environmental Implications. So this is a live webinar and it's being recorded. If you have any questions for Dr. Michalek during the webinar, please write them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. So at this time, please put your mics on mute and we will open up the lines later for questions. So at this time, I'm handing it over to Dr. Michalek. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. The slides up shared full screen. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is we've been doing a lot of relevant work about electric vehicle adoption and environmental implications. I've been working on this topic since maybe 2007, and we have a lot of recent work. So what I'm going to do is try to synthesize some of it and tie it together. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent work we have on topics related to vehicle adoption potential. There'll be a couple of related topics to adoption potential, cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks, and consumer preferences for those. Delivery vehicles, which are a little different because the adoption decisions are more driven by economics. And then fast charging and equity, because those affect both first adopters and the second adopters who buy used vehicles in terms of the dependency on fast chargers and the age, the life that the battery will last. And then in part two, I will talk about electric vehicle life cycle emissions, including some study published or two studies published so far this year and another couple that are currently in process. So part one is about adoption potential. And I'm going to talk about two papers that one is in print and the other one is in review about consumer preferences. What we do to try to assess consumer preferences for electric vehicles is we run these controlled experiments in which we ask consumers to choose among some real vehicle profiles. And we try to back out from their choices what's driving the choices, like what the things they most value. So this is an example of one of the questions from one of our surveys. These are all randomly generated and different for every question and every respondent. But the idea is the respondent chooses a vehicle aesthetic that they like, and then they come to a stage in a survey where they're asked, okay, you're going to get this vehicle, but which powertrain do you want in it? Depending on whether it's electric, plug-in hybrid, gasoline, you'll have a different purchase price, you'll have different operating costs, different performance like acceleration. And we did an experiment like this in 2012, 2013, and we updated and repeated it in 2020, 2021. And the main thing that we found was that the consumer preferences really haven't changed over that time. The things consumers value have been pretty static, or at least there's not statistically significant differences between those two fieldings. That doesn't mean that they're not changing which vehicles they're buying. It's just the reason they're changing. The reason they're buying more electric vehicles isn't so much because they've changed their minds about electric vehicles. It's because they've always placed value on range and low cost and good performance and fast refueling time. And electric vehicles just have more to offer now as the technology changes. So what's exciting about the idea that the preferences seem to be relatively stable is then we could project into the future and say, well, if these same consumers who value the same things are faced with choices for new technologies in the future that have better range and lower cost, how might we expect them to respond to those new technologies in the future? So we did that with a bunch of specific vehicles and then for the full market. So the Nissan Leaf was the only electric vehicle in the set that was available back when we were doing the original study. And it improved from 2013 to 2022, even if the consumers prefer the same things and haven't changed what they value and what they're willing to pay for. Just the fact that the range has gone up and the cost has gone down increases the willingness to pay. The range going up increases the willingness to pay, and the cost coming down makes less of a gap. And we would project that in 2030, if we use estimates from a recent National Academy consensus report, that the attributes of electric vehicles will continue to get better as the cost continues to decline. And we see a crossover point happening where the average willingness to pay in the population starts to exceed the price premium, and you get a lot more adoption even without putting in subsidies. And we looked across the entire market. Of course, what happens in the full market really depends on what kinds of electric vehicles are going to be available in the future and how many gasoline vehicles will continue to be available. So we just ran a scenario in which we assumed that every gasoline vehicle available would offer an electric version, and that the electric vehicle version would have attributes like what the National Academies project. Under that scenario and the preferences that we've measured, we see a majority or near majority of both cars and SUVs of consumers, being interested to adopt electric vehicles. We repeated the same exercise with pickup trucks, but this is a separate survey. We hadn't done the pickup trucks in 2013. We're just starting those now. And pickup trucks have only just entered the market. Electric versions of pickup trucks have only just entered the market, and still too new to know what's going to happen using just market data alone. So we used, again, this controlled experiment approach. And what we do is once we get our responses, we use a latent class logit model, which is a way to categorize consumers based on patterns in their choices, not based on their demographics, but just based on like similarities in what vehicles they're willing to choose over other vehicles. And when we do this, we find that there's about 45% of our respondents, of our weighted respondents, fall into a group that we call tech indifferent, because they don't really have strong preferences for electric over gasoline or gasoline over electric. If they offer the same attributes, they're pretty indifferent between the two technologies. So the key for this group is it offering better attributes? What's the range? What's the operating cost? What's the performance attributes? And for pickup trucks, things like hauling and towing capacity matter as well. The second group, about 28% of our weighted respondents, we call electric enthusiasts. These are respondents who are much more likely to choose the electric vehicle. They have a preference. If the attributes are the same, they prefer electric over gasoline. And so they're much more likely to choose as the attributes get better. And the last group we call electric opposed, is about 26% of the weighted sample. The electric opposed consumers have such a strong negative value for electric that there's almost nothing you could do to win over these consumers just by improving the attributes. If the cost comes down a lot, the range goes up, the hauling capacity goes up, that's not enough to compensate for the amount that they dislike electric compared to gasoline, at least with their current preferences in the survey. So when we repeat that same exercise looking into the future, if all gasoline pickup trucks had an electric version, what would we expect these consumers to do? We could see in 2030, where price premiums come down and range goes up and other attributes remain comparable, that somewhere in the neighborhood of half of consumers would be willing to adopt an electric pickup truck over a gasoline pickup truck. Getting from 0 to 50, though, might be easier than getting from 50 to 100%, because those electric opposed consumers have such strong negative preferences that if they don't change their preferences, then they can't just be won over by technology improvement. So getting to 100% would require either changing those preferences, like winning hearts and minds, or restricting the availability of alternatives. Like if gasoline pickup trucks just aren't available, then these consumers may still buy pickup trucks. But when given the option, they strongly prefer gasoline. And we looked, again, we didn't categorize these consumers based on their demographics. We categorized them based on the choices they made. But after we had them in categories, we look back to say, is there anything in common about the consumers who fall into these categories? And for these electric opposed, we found patterns that you might expect. That group is much less likely to believe in climate change. They come from more rural areas, and there are fewer DC fast chargers in those neighborhoods. And so maybe the one of those that we could have some control over is with the Inflation Reduction Act and the rollout of new and the bipartisan infrastructure law and the rollout of new charging infrastructure. That may be a lever. I mean, it doesn't say causally that this will change anybody's mind, but that is certainly a factor that this group has in common. And so a change there could potentially be a factor that would sway some of these respondents. So that was all for cars, trucks, and SUVs, which are bought by ordinary consumers. We've also been doing some work on electric delivery trucks. And for these, when you're buying a fleet of trucks, you're going to run the calculations, see what the net cost is going to be over the life. And so that's likely to be a bigger driver than kind of these willingness to pay weighing the attributes. So we looked at economics, comparing diesel delivery trucks to electric delivery trucks in a bunch of different markets that differ in the geography, the kinds of deliveries they're doing, and what the tariff structure looks like, meaning how much electricity costs and how much the cost for electricity changes throughout the day. And so we find that electric delivery trucks can be competitive with diesel trucks today, but there's this really big bar in the first orange electric unmanaged charging. And the reason is because there's a lot of uncertainty. It really depends when you charge, where you charge. Are you charging, do all the charging happening at the warehouse where you're loading up the goods? Is some of the charging happening along the route where you stop at a public charging station? And is it coordinated? Like, is all the charging at the warehouse happening right at the time that the warehouse has peak demand, and that will induce some demand charges from the power system? So depending on those things, if you get a really badly coordinated outcome, you could end up with much higher costs. But as long as you can manage and pay attention to the differences of those charging and coordinate the deliveries with the charging, you can be competitive with diesel now. And even in some cases, these Northern and Southern California cases, there are cases where if you are strategic about when you charge and you use the vehicle to offset some of the facility's load right at the time that it's demanding its peak load, you can actually lower the demand charges from the power system, and you can end up with negative costs. I mean, this is from two things: from lowering the demand charges at the facilities where you're loading the goods, and also buying electricity at times that it's cheap and selling it back at times when it's expensive. And so this coordination of how you manage the delivery and the charging of an electric vehicle has a lot of potential benefits in some markets to even run at negative cost, where running the electric vehicle and doing the deliveries is free, and then you're getting all the revenue from the deliveries as well. So that points to both the importance of coordination and the potential to push on electric delivery in some of these markets first, where they could be particularly attractive. Okay, and then the last topic I wanted to touch that's related to adoption is the EV battery resilience to fast charging. If you have an electric vehicle and you have a garage, most of us can install a electrical outlet in that garage and charge the electric vehicle there. And we won't really need public charging infrastructure very often, just kind of when we go on a long trip and we want to use a highway rest stop, that sort of thing. But if you live in a multifamily dwelling, or even a single family dwelling that is in an urban area, you might be less likely to have any off-street parking. And if you don't, then you're going to rely on public charging infrastructure, which will probably include a lot of fast chargers, because those are the only ways to get your car fueled up at a speed that's anything like gasoline. So we have been testing a bunch of battery cells to see how they perform when you charge them really fast. There are three major types of lithium-ion battery chemistries that are used in electric vehicles today. LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate, NCA, which is nickel cobalt aluminum, and NMC, which is nickel manganese cobalt. And so we acquired a bunch of these automotive battery cells, we put them in this test rig, and we cycle them up and down, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, and we vary across the cells how often they're doing fast charging versus slow charging. And then we look to see how that affects the degradation of the cells. And what we find is that there's a really big difference. The lithium iron phosphate cells at the top, those are the kind of cells you would get in a Tesla today if it was a low range, like the baseline range Tesla. Those are being sold with lithium iron phosphate. And those cells you can abuse. I mean, you can cycle them all the way down to 0, all the way up to 100%, fast charging it every time, and still get that battery to last a very long life. 100,000 miles here before you even really start to see a decline under that level of abuse. And so for LFP cells, even the second owner who's buying a used electric vehicle and relying a lot on charging infrastructure may not experience a battery failure, and it's very robust. The story is very different for the nickel cobalt aluminum, NCA, which are the cells you would get today on a high range Tesla. And for those, if you abuse them a lot, you can kill them really fast. Like if you charge them 0 to 100% and do that 100% fast charging, you can see that orange line dying off really fast, not much life out of that battery. Now, that's not how people actually charge. I mean, the software in the vehicle restricts so that you don't really charge it all the way from 0 to all the way to 100, and also restricts the speed at which you charge. That can help mitigate some of these longevity issues. But of course, that comes with compromises. If you're not using the whole battery, you don't get as much range. If you're charging slowly, then you're not able to charge as fast. So there's some real differences across the chemistries, and it could mean particularly high battery replacement cost. I mean, nobody would really replace the battery this many times, but if you were to use a nickel cobalt aluminum battery, fast charge it 100% of the time, and then over 8 years keep replacing the battery every time it dies, I mean, you could be spending over $100,000 in battery replacement costs. And so, doing partial utilization kind of limits that issue, but there's still a problem that can occur if you're doing too much fast charging. Whereas with lithium iron phosphate, none of the cases that we ran involved a battery replacement over 8 years because the batteries are just so robust. So we're thinking about like what, consumers buying a used electric vehicle in particular the chemistry might really matter, but it's not easy to find out what kind of chemistry your vehicle has. And the public doesn't really have a ton of capacity to absorb this detailed information. And so we're trying to figure out how to use this information to try to help make sure that consumers don't end up with dead vehicles, especially those secondhand consumers who might not be as wealthy and are relying on it for transportation and relying on that public charging infrastructure. So all of that was about some of the things we've been looking at with vehicle adoption potential. In part 2, I'm going to focus on environmental implications. And as I mentioned, I think my first environmental study about electric vehicles was maybe 2009. I guess I may have had some in grad school too, but anyway, something like that. So I've been thinking about environmental issues of electric vehicles for a long time. And we have recent studies. I mean, it's interesting that it's not a fully solved problem yet. You'd think, well, we know what the environmental implications of electric vehicles are. There have been a lot of studies, but there's still some really important nuances that can swing the answer, and I'm going to talk about some of those today. So when we're talking about the life cycle emissions from an electric vehicle, we're talking about all of the emissions that are produced life cycle emissions for a vehicle in general. We're talking about all the emissions that are produced not only during vehicle use, like tailpipe emissions, but we're also talking about emissions in production of the vehicle and emissions in production of the gasoline that gets burned in the vehicle. And as you switch to electric vehicles, you get higher impacts from battery production, especially when they're large batteries. The larger the battery, the more materials you have to source and produce that battery. And I don't get too hung up on this particular result, which kind of shows battery electric vehicles not winning. This is from 2019 data. I'm going to show you how this answer about how good electric vehicles are relative to gasoline, how it's changing over time and what it mostly depends on. But to give you a sense, that's the life cycle that we're thinking about. And because the life cycle relies so much on emissions from the power grid, it matters what the mix of the power grid is, and that varies a lot regionally. This is a complicated thing to answer because the power grid is massively interconnected. There are tons of generators feeding into the network and tons of users consuming electricity from the network. And it's not like the electrons get traced from one generator to one user. They're all in the same soup. And so, but that soup isn't homogeneous. You can see in this graph just from the colors that this graph is divided into NERC regions, which are some of the ways that the grid is organized. And there tends to be more electricity flow within one of these regions than across regions. But if you buy electricity in San Francisco, that doesn't mean power plants in San Francisco are responding to the load. It's power plants in the entire network. It's what is the cheapest way in that moment to increase generation in order to meet the new load from that electric vehicle. So those are the kinds of things that we've done a lot of studies looking at. Now, there are two main ways to think about this life cycle assessment, and I was part of a National Academy's group that put out a report 2 years ago, shown in the bottom right, looking at these different ways of doing life cycle assessment. Historically, the attributional was definitely most common. You would say something like, well, if electric vehicles are X% of the load of the amount of electricity that we're generating, then assign them X% of the emissions from generating that electricity, which makes a lot of sense. However, that answer turns out to really depend on what we choose as the region of study to divide the emissions over. And there is no single boundary that fully describes what happens with electricity. Like any boundary you draw, electricity flows across that boundary. And so this can be, you can get really different answers here depending on where you draw the boundary. And the most informed studies will usually use boundaries that are meaningful from a power grid perspective. So just saying, what are the power plants near my city or in my state isn't really that relevant because it has more to do with which power plants are the ones that respond to new load in your area of the country. So the other way to think about this is consequentially. And what you do there is you have to estimate what the power system would do in two different scenarios. One where you don't have that extra electric vehicle load, and the other one where you do have that extra vehicle load. And then you look at the difference in the emissions across those two scenarios, and you say, well, that's the consequence of adding, if I add that PEV load, that's what's going to change in terms of the emissions. So that is consequential. And what the consensus report says is that if both of these have really valid reasons to use for different purposes. But if you want to do policy analysis, like if you're considering setting a new policy and you want to understand what the effect of that policy would be, that's consequential. You need a consequential analysis for that type of question. So we have done a bunch of consequential studies on electric vehicles, and I'm going to summarize key results from a few of them. So these first two were both published earlier this year. And I'll just do one slide for the first one, which is looking across the country at how different electric vehicles compare to different gasoline vehicles on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, as we discussed, it depends where you are regionally, because the power grid looks different regionally. It also matters regionally because temperature matters. Cold weather, for example, makes all vehicles less efficient, but it makes electric vehicles especially less efficient. And so the relative competitiveness of electric vehicles is worse when it's colder. But a key part of the interest here was how different the comparison of electric versus gasoline is, depending on which vehicles we're talking about. So if you compare a Nissan Leaf electric vehicle to a Honda Accord gasoline vehicle, that's this map in the bottom left. It's almost all white, which means the Nissan Leaf is beating the Honda Accord pretty much everywhere. Like there's nowhere where the grid needs to be cleaner in order for the Leaf to beat the Accord. But if you look at the top right graph, that's comparing a Tesla Model S to a Toyota Prius. And the colors mean that the grid would have to get cleaner in order for the Tesla Model S to beat the Toyota Prius. Toyota Prius is a very efficient gasoline vehicle, so its emissions are quite low. And the Tesla Model S is not the most efficient electric vehicle. And so if those are the two you're comparing, you're going to end up with a very different story. So one of the things that's tricky about looking at all these life cycle studies is they tend to compare electric vehicle to gasoline vehicle, but depending what you choose as your representative electric and gasoline, you can get really different answers. And so we explore that in this study. That prior map, though, was only for greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are certainly a primary area of focus, but turns out they're not all that matters. Air pollutants also really matter. And if we really want to dig in, we're going to have to narrow scope and focus in on a particular region so we can model it in more detail. So that's what we did with the PJM region, which is the largest regional transmission organization in the United States. It serves 13 states in the District of Columbia. It spans from Chicago to Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., North Carolina. And the power grid mix in PJM is similar to North America as a whole. And we had done a study of this back some years ago using grid data from 2010. And we had found that in this PJM region, that an electric vehicle would create quite a bit more air emissions externalities, meaning the cost of damages caused by those air emissions, than a gasoline vehicle. And that was primarily because of sulfur dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants. When the electric vehicle plugs in, power plants have to increase generation to supply the new load. The ones that increase that generation tend to be fossil fuel plants, and a healthy portion of them in PJM are coal. And the coal releases sulfur dioxide, which which reacts in the atmosphere to form fine particles. And then people downwind breathe those particles and get increased cases of cardiovascular and respiratory disease. So in quantifying all of that, we actually found the electric vehicle to be doing worse back then. But we predicted, yes, a lot of coal plants are going to be retiring, and as they retire, this comparison is going to become much more competitive. So what we did this year, published this year, is update that study. And the most recent grid data we had available for all the information we would need to fully model the system was 2019. And we did see a huge improvement as coal retired. And we anticipate looking out to 2025 based on what plants were scheduled to be built or retired, that we would continue to improve and that electric vehicles would become comparable to gasoline vehicles in PJM. But where we go in the future, it's not guaranteed to keep going down. In fact, it's the most likely cases that will sort of flatten out, because even though we're building a lot of new wind and solar and the grid's getting cleaner overall, the way the grid responds to changes in load, like the consequences of buying an electric vehicle versus a gasoline vehicle, still hinges a lot on what the fossil fuel mix looks like. And it will, at least for the next decade. And so over that next decade, so I'll say, and just to be clear, in the long run, displacing fossil fuel with renewables is going to be a way we can get clean electricity to charge all these vehicles. But the effects of adopting electric vehicles in the short run over the, say, the next decade hinge a lot more on other things like the battery chemistry. It turns out that these bottom cases, the cases that end up with the lowest total air emission externalities for electric vehicles, involve a change of battery chemistry to this lithium iron phosphate that I talked about earlier. And that's kind of a neat thing. In fact, it turns out we've got a few studies, including a third one that was also published this year, on the next slide, that are all sort of pointing us toward this lithium iron phosphate chemistry as being a good thing for electric vehicles, because it's more robust to fast charge, as we talked about, so it can last longer, including for the second owner. It has lower life cycle externalities. All of the cases in our scenarios that we ran that had the lowest emissions over the next decade involved switching to that lithium iron phosphate chemistry. And that's primarily because nickel mining involves a lot of sulfur dioxide emissions as well, although that varies a lot depending on where we get our nickel. There's some nuances there that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if you have questions. And then the third is a paper I won't talk about today, but just to mention, we have another paper out this year in Nature Communications that lithium iron phosphate also has fewer supply chain disruption pathways because it only has one critical material, lithium, and doesn't need a ton of that. Unlike the other nickel-based chemistries that use nickel and cobalt and maybe manganese. And so lithium iron phosphate has fewer pathways, like fewer types of geopolitical or natural disaster type disruptions that could interfere with our ability to keep making these electric vehicles. And so that has some robustness advantages as well. So all of the studies that I've been talking about so far with electric vehicles and all of the ones I've published so far look at how adopting electric vehicles will change the way the power system generates electricity to charge. And but we have always been assuming that the power system itself, like the kinds of generators we have, are exogenous, that we already know what they're going to be, and electric vehicles aren't going to change which power plants we build. What we're doing right now with two studies is to try to question that assumption and say, is it possible that electric vehicle charging itself could cause us to build power plants that we wouldn't have built otherwise? Like, might we get more wind and solar just because we have those electric vehicles on the grid? And so we have two different studies with different scopes looking at this, and the answer seems to be yes. In fact, particularly if that load is flexible. So let me walk you through some data here. In the first of these studies, we're using the Reeds model, which is a power system model built by NREL. And we're running it with different scenarios of electric vehicle adoption. We're using the Inflation Reduction Act IRA curve here as our baseline of the default of what might happen in the near future, out to 2050. And then we're running cases that are higher and lower based on policies or stated objectives, including Biden administration targets, the EPA's projections about how the new light-duty fuel economy standards will translate into electrification, and the Energy Information Administration has this annual energy outlook where they did not include the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so there's kind of a lower case to look at as well. So we look across all of these cases and say, if we adopt more electric vehicles versus fewer electric vehicles, what would be the difference in grid emissions? Like, by adopting more electric vehicles, are we going to create tons of new grid emissions or only a little bit? And we find, in fact, that EV adoption can induce new wind and solar expansion. Look at this bottom line here. This is the change in capacity relative to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act case. So the IRA is blank. It's just a flat line because that's the reference point. And if we go higher, if we go to the Biden goals or the EPA estimates of how the greenhouse gas emission standards for light-duty vehicles will drive electric vehicle adoption, in these higher adoption cases, we see a growth in wind and solar and storage and some fossil fuels, mostly nuclear, to balance out the intermittency of some of these and complement the more intermittent renewables. So that means this thing is happening, or can happen rather, that more electric vehicle adoption can lead to more wind and solar construction than we would have had otherwise. And that varies across the country, but you see a lot of yellow here and a lot of blue. Yellow is solar and blue is wind. There are some areas where there's more expansion of gas or even coal in early years. So the net implications of this are that because electric vehicles can create economic conditions where new wind and solar gets built, they actually can have a much better effect on the grid than we would have thought when we were ignoring that effect. And so in the early years, you could still see some substantial changes in CO2 emissions per vehicle. It could even be higher than gasoline vehicles, as we saw in some of the other work. But as we move forward, with this effect of inducing new wind and solar construction, you end up that the emissions effect of electric vehicles is quite a bit smaller than we would have thought otherwise, and quite a bit smaller than the gasoline vehicles being displaced. So there's a really good story here. And in fact, that story gets better if we if the electric vehicles have flexible load. I'll explain what that means. So actually, let me explain before I show this complicated chart. So what I mean by flexible load, so an inflexible load would be a load where when I get home from work, I plug the car in and it starts charging right away. That's what I have now. I have a plug-in hybrid in the garage. And when I plug it in, it just starts charging. And so if I get home at 6 o'clock, then it starts charging at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock is a time when the electricity has a lot of demand. And so a lot of the plants are running at higher levels because to try to meet the demand. But there's an alternative. I could say, hey, I'm home at 6 o'clock. I want my vehicle charged, but I don't really need it charged until, say, 6 a.m. the next morning. So I could tell the grid to, just as long as my vehicle's charged by 6 a.m., I'm fine. So charge it whenever you want. And doing that, it could, instead of starting it right away at 6, it could delay it until in the evening and charge it later. And that would be useful for the power grid, both on a cost perspective and potentially for creating these economic conditions that help us build more renewables. So what we're looking at here is the difference in the revenues that could be generated by variable renewable energy, VRE, that just means wind and solar. And then this is the case of wind. And so the red line is if we don't have any electric vehicles at all. And the purple line is if we have electric vehicles, but they just start charging as soon as they get home from the last trip of the day. And there's a slight increase in revenue potential for wind and solar, but it's pretty small. That red and purple line are almost on top of each other. But if you switch to the yellow or mustard colored line, the controlled charging, and you let the grid operator decide when to charge your vehicle, then there becomes more incentive to build more wind and solar. I mean, the wind is blowing hard at some moments, less hard at other moments. And if you can control the load, like delay the charging a bit, and then when the wind picks up, charge the vehicle more again, you can make it more economical to build more wind and solar. And that's especially true in this kind of sea green color V to G, which is vehicle to grid. This is when not only does the grid operator decide when to charge your vehicle, but it can actually take energy back from your vehicle in moments when it really needs it to balance out the grid. And doing that, again, the vehicle could still be fully charged at 6 in the morning, but it may go up and down throughout the evening, throughout the night once it's plugged in. Doing that really creates an incentive to build more wind, about 10 gigawatts more wind than would have been built in this PJM study without the electric vehicles. So if we look at the implications for that extra wind and solar, it's really interesting. If you go from the first bar, which is when we don't have any electric vehicles at all, you have a certain amount of environmental damages from greenhouse gas emissions, NOx, SO2, and particulate matter. And if we move to converting 10% of our vehicle fleet to electric, but we don't control the charging, this UC means uncontrolled charging. It's just charged whenever the people get home from work. Then you get some increase in emissions because you added new load to the grid and with the electric vehicles charging, and the grid had to respond by producing more electricity, and so you get more emissions. But cool thing happens when that charging is controlled, or in particular, when you use vehicle to grid and it's like a bi-directional control, is that you end up building so much more wind and solar that the net emissions in the whole power grid actually go down. Like you add new load and the power system has to produce more energy to meet that load, and yet the total emissions actually decrease instead of increasing. And that's just because if the economic incentives are there and you build that additional wind, the wind can charge not only the vehicles, but it can charge other things, supply energy for other parts of the economy as well. So again, these last two studies are still preliminary. They have not gone through peer review yet, but these early results are quite exciting, and we'll be getting them in through the review process this year. So that's what I wanted to cover, and I'll be very happy to take questions. I'll just mention that we do try to, one of my departments is engineering and public policy, and this is a pretty unique department in which we do technically deep work, but we really try to keep it connected to knowledge that would help make better policy decisions. And so we do a lot of these policy briefs and public comments and submit comments to when EPA has a new rule. We'll often submit comments if it's related to the things that we study. And so this little QR code will get you to the website, or the URL is there as well. But we do try to keep things on the front page that are just bottom line headline style, findings, like what do we know now that we didn't know before the study. And then we keep these policy briefs and videos and links to media where we try to talk to the general public or talk to policymakers about the implications of the work. So I'm always very interested in hearing more like what questions policymakers are thinking about, because it sometimes totally changes the direction of our research, because we think, oh, that is a really interesting question. Let's see if we can find an answer and make it, and then feed that back into the policy process. And that's all I had to say. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Let's see here. Let's go back to here. Let's address some questions. I think there was some in the chat. Let's see here. A comment. First comment is I put solar panels on my house here in Florida. It powers my house, my golf cart, and my car. Green energy. Good job. Another commenter. Fast chargers are a game changer. Oh, here we go. Here's a question. If an electric vehicle has an LFP battery, is there a certain state of charge that you should regularly charge the batteries to extend the life of the battery?
That's a great question, and I can comment on the other ones too. But that's a great question. So, to my knowledge, because LFP is so robust, it doesn't have that kind of memory issue like you might have had in a nickel metal hydride battery, where, well, there's two different things. One is keeping the battery at a lower state of charge to extend its life. That is the case with nickel-based batteries, but not so much with lithium iron phosphate batteries. Lithium iron phosphate tends to degrade just with use, and not so much with where you keep the state of charge. There are some experts that I can point to that would know a lot more than this than I do, but that's kind of the broad stroke of it. So I think if you have an LFP battery, you kind of don't have to worry about it because it's so robust and it's not sensitive to the state of charge where you leave it in the way that the nickel batteries are. And I was also going to mention, yeah, I do think fast chargers are a really big game changer. And I think there's two big cases where fast chargers really matter. One is for long distance travel. I mean, even if it takes me 20 minutes to charge, which is still pretty fast for a fast charger, that's adding, if I have to charge, depending on the range of my vehicle. When those early Nissan Leafs came out, it was like the 5-hour drive to see my family in Michigan turned into like an 8-hour drive with all of the stops you'd have to make and waiting for charging and this sort of thing. So that's not a small inconvenience. And so as we've moved to larger ranges and faster charging, it's really started to make it much more, it's different than owning a gasoline vehicle, but it's made it much more substitutable, I would say. So.
Thank you. Here's another one. You touched on emissions and health. Are we seeing health benefits as we see more electrical electric vehicles being sold?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not aware of any kind of epidemiological study that could link health outcomes directly to electric vehicles. But the data that we're basing our estimates on are from more general epidemiological studies. So there's really two parts to it. One is you look at populations that are more exposed to air pollution and those that are less exposed to air pollution. You try to control for other factors, and you look to see how much increasing or making air quality worse is associated with increased mortality. And so there's a bunch of different studies that try to do that. And so we have like estimates of how air quality will affect mortality. And the other part of it is, well, if I release some more emissions from my tailpipe or from a power plant, how will that change the air quality? And for that, we have detailed air quality models that model the movement of those particles and the chemistry, atmospheric chemistry as they react, and the dispersion as they sort of spread out in a plume. And there's been an effort that Carnegie Mellon was part of, and it was an EPA funded effort. I think it was about a $10 million center where we worked with a lot of these models and built versions of them that run a lot faster that can be used for policy analysis. And so those are the models that we ended up using here because they run fast enough that you can actually look at a variety of scenarios and try to get estimates of like mortality risk. So I think even though I don't think we can directly say we've measured changes in health as people adopt more electric vehicles, we certainly measured things that lead us to strongly believe that this is the relationship.
Thank you. There's a second part. Also, if both kinds of cars share the same space at shopping malls or schools, then those charging their cars may still be exposed to poor air quality while sitting in their cars. So, because that's a comment to the question.
Yeah, I can add to that most of the air quality damages that we're talking about are at much longer length scales. We're not talking about sitting near an idling car and breathing in, the exhaust that's coming right out of the car. It's that when you emit that exhaust, it travels with the wind and then it turns into particles downwind. So the kind of thing you would get from directly being near the exhaust pipe would be direct particulate matter, like there's little particles coming out of the tailpipe and then you're breathing them in, they get stuck in your lungs. But it turns out that an even bigger source of that is secondary particulate matter, where we emit things like sulfur dioxide. Those are not these small particles, but they turn into small particles as they float in the atmosphere. And so that could be there's a power plant in Pittsburgh, let's say, it might affect air quality in New York City. I mean, we're talking long distances, and that's particularly relevant with power plants. It's not about living in the down the street from a power plant. It's about whether you're in the wake of the power plant as the wind blows, and how much that affects your air quality. Because these are chronic things. It's not about what you breathe in one day. It's about all the exposure you accumulate over time.
Thank you. And then she followed up with, loved this. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Let's see, another question. Are there different subsidies being provided to companies making EVs with the LFP batteries versus the nickel batteries?
That's a great question. Sort of. So none of the subsidies that I'm aware of single out one of the chemistries over another, but the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, which were created partly to encourage more electric vehicle adoption, but they were really designed to encourage a onshoring and diversification of the supply chain. Like right now, the vast majority of batteries pass through China at some point. And if there is a restriction in flow out of China for whatever reason, that would disrupt a lot of the supply chains for making electric vehicle batteries. And so, so the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of incentives for doing parts of the supply chain in the United States and in other countries, like trade countries where we have free trade relationships. So when we looked in detail at what these subsidies are, like how they subsidize, they actually subsidize the nickel-based chemistries a little bit more than the lithium iron phosphate. So, from our research, I would say, well, if I would going to go one direction, I would go the other direction. I would prefer to subsidize the lithium iron phosphate more because it seems to have more benefits. But the nickel batteries are a bit more expensive. And because some of the subsidies are on a percentage basis, they actually end up getting a little bit more help. And so that's something we point out in a study that we have under review now. And maybe it's a small part of a much bigger policy, but certainly relevant to the question you asked.
Thank you. Another question. Do you research heavy-duty diesel to electric? Both IRA and bill are funding replacing heavy-duty diesel school buses and trucks with electric vehicles. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I have not personally studied heavy duty truck electrification, but some of my colleagues have. And the big issue with the heavy duty, we're talking about like Class 8 trucks that you would, be driving next to on the highway that are taking all the Amazon packages from one, warehouse to another or something like that. So for those trucks, the big issue is that they drive long distances, which means they need to hold a lot of fuel. And if you store that in batteries, it takes up space and weight, which means you can't put as many goods in the trailer. And so then you actually need more trucks to do the same amount of hauling. And so that is part of the trade-off there. And heavy duty trucks is one of the places where people think hydrogen may be more viable even long run, because you can only do so much with batteries in terms of compacting and getting a lot of energy into a small space. But the study that I did talk about today was for the delivery vehicles. Those are more medium duty vehicles, and they still have that same trade-off. But yes, replacing those medium duty vehicles really looks like there is at least an opportunity for a wash, if not even a net benefit in some places on cost. And then they can give you this emissions benefit at least as long as the grid is cleaning up. So school buses also seem like a really good idea to me because they do so much stop and go. And anytime you have electric, you can absorb some of the energy. Like when you stop with a gasoline or a diesel vehicle, you're just using brake pads to squeeze the caliper, and it just turns motion into heat, and then you lose it all. Whereas with electric, you actually recover some of that energy as electricity and you put it back into the battery, and then you can use it again the next time you take off. So there's some real benefits to buses and school buses and those kinds of applications.
Thank you. Have you done any research into the environmental impacts once the useful life of EVs ends?
That's a great question. The closest thing, so the thing that we're thinking about when the life of an EV ends, I mean, the main difference between that and a gasoline vehicle is that you've got these batteries at the end of life that are depleted. And so there's two potential positive routes that you could go with them. One is to recycle them. And there are like deep recycling where you actually use hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical processes to break the battery back down into like its original elements. And it's not a battery anymore. It's just you recover some nickel and you recover some cobalt, and then you sell that back on the nickel and cobalt markets. So there's also a more shallow kind of recycling where you might be able to reuse some of the components by like refreshing the cathode and then putting it back into a new battery and getting it out without having to break everything down into individual elements. And I'm interested to study this. I have not built my own models yet, but my understanding is that recycling facilities, I mean, I visited a battery recycling facility in Pennsylvania, and they were pretty clear that they swim or sink based on the price of nickel. That of all the things they can produce, nickel's the thing with value. And so that presents a really interesting question about, I'm sort of saying lithium iron phosphate has this real benefits, but it doesn't have very valuable materials in it. It doesn't have nickel in it, doesn't have cobalt in it. It just has lithium. And so that means that it's cheaper to produce, maybe it'll last longer, but then when we do dispose of it at the end of life, it may be less likely to be recycled because there's no money in recycling it unless there's some law that sort of forces us to. So I think there's some really interesting trade-offs there. And the only other thing I'll mention on there is there may be some other uses where the vehicle reaches the end of life for the vehicle. Sorry, the battery reaches the end of life for the vehicle. It's maybe not good enough to keep driving a vehicle around, but it might still be good enough for something else, like a different application, like stationary storage. So there's a bunch of work trying to figure out if we can take a bunch of these used batteries, figure out which ones are still good enough for these other applications, repackage them, have some control algorithms to make sure they work well together, and get them reused in a second life. We had a big effort with the University of Michigan trying to work on this, and didn't end up getting funded. So, but this is a question that's certainly on a lot of people's minds.
Thank you. They followed up with very interesting research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what I'll do is I'll open up the lines if anyone has a question that they want to ask directly. So I have a question. It's a rudimentary question.
Sure.
And I don't know if it goes back to the chemistry differences between the different batteries, but if an individual starts with an NCA battery, and I don't know about the electrical components or if it's easy to replace it with an LFP battery, does it require additional wiring or any other type of mechanisms to be able to afford to do that?
I see. So like if you had an NCA battery and then it died and you were going to replace it, can you replace it with a different kind of battery? Good question. It's definitely not immediately obvious that you could, because those batteries are going to have different voltages, different control algorithms for different for figuring out how much energy is left in the battery, which is actually harder to do with LFP. And so it's not just plug and play like that. But is it possible that someone will have a replacement battery where they work through all those issues? That could be possible. I don't know. The first electric vehicle I had, we got a Toyota Prius, and then we put in a battery pack in the back to convert it into a. Sorry, we got a regular Toyota Prius, and then we put an extra battery in the back to convert it into a plug-in vehicle. That was a lithium iron phosphate battery, and so but that was a sort of a custom thing. That wasn't like going to the dealership and have them replace it. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, and my sense is in general no, but it's possible if all the engineering challenges were addressed.
Got it. Michelle has a question.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on the heavy duty diesel question. With the bipartisan infrastructure law funding $5 billion for over 5 years for electric school buses, I feel like that number of school buses would definitely have an impact on exactly what you're researching, because of I don't know if that's significant as far as the number, but I mean already there's a few thousand buses, electric buses, charging today. And when I first started working on the clean school bus projects, I kind of had the idea that a lot of schools, especially here in the Midwest, would charge at night and probably just use level 2 charging overnight. But it turns out a lot of schools, I would say the majority, are doing the level 3 DC fast charging because they want to charge during the day. And I think that makes a big difference with the the power supply and production, and then too here in the Midwest, it's a lot of coal. So the trucks, I mean, we haven't funded any yet, but we'll see what shakes out on the number of heavy duty diesel trucks. I know that refuse haulers are probably kind of what I have in mind as far as maybe a popular project. I don't expect that, we'll have any over the road class 8 semis, but we'll see. You never know. There might be somebody.
Yeah, both of those. So it's interesting. I haven't talked with a lot of school bus electrification, so I'm really interested to learn about that. So the level, I understand they want to charge during the day, but I think of school buses as they do a route once in the morning, maybe twice. They take the high school kids and then the younger kids, and then they just sit there until after school. So I would think they might have enough time to charge back up with level 2, but
So,
you're saying they use level 3.
yeah, so I think a lot of it is it's two things. It's everyone, a lot of people are very skeptical. Is it going to have enough range?
Uh-huh.
Is the bus going to have enough range to do morning and afternoon? And then there's always the little kids mixed in during the day with the various different routes. But you know, we're talking about a few buses at a school, not the entire fleet of buses, right?
Uh-huh.
So, but those buses, I think because they're just unsure. And the second factor is EPA is providing a portion of funding for charging. So if you have $20,000, available to put in a level 3, then there's surely somebody, trying to sell that to you, whether you need it or not. So when they can, or because they want to, they really, are unsure and question the range, they will absolutely buy a level 3 if they can.
That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of ties to the questions about the whether you're using the vehicle in a way that is well coordinated so that it saves cost, or maybe you're using it in an uncoordinated way. And the reality is that there's going to be a lot of instances like this where it's like, well, I got the fast charger, I'm just going to charge it, fast. It gives me flexibility in case I need to use the bus when I wasn't expecting to, and that might not be good for an overall cost. And so it's one thing for the initial demonstration projects and things that not everything has to go perfectly. You learn from it. But then I think if we're rolling out larger, those are exactly the kind of issues we'll probably want to resolve and figure out how to, incentivize or automate some of the systems that can help, schedule the charging well.
I think initially the schools that are adopting the electric school buses, right off, they're just trying to beat diesel fuel cost.
Uh-huh.
And that, as long as they can beat the diesel fuel cost, they're proving its worth to the school board and the community. So maybe I hope that eventually it gets to where they're trying to, really take advantage of charging off peak. So
Yep.
to help
Good.
the
Yeah,
emissions
thanks.
overall.
Thanks for that comment and for the information. I'll be thinking more about buses now the rest of the day.
Thank you, Michelle. There is one last question. I don't know if it's an easy answer. Is Tesla winning the charging race versus other companies?
Well, Tesla's definitely dominating electric vehicle adoption, light duty vehicle adoption in the US. And, they had a different strategy early on. Electric vehicles, the experience most people would have with electric vehicles might be like a golf cart. And Tesla, instead of trying to the problem with electric vehicles, they're so expensive. And so instead of trying to take all the cost stuff out of it and get it closer to the cost of a gasoline vehicle and make it small and limited range and all that, they just went the other way and they said, hey, this is an elite vehicle. And what is neat about that is in some sense the wealthy buyers kind of paid for some of the transition, so that the costs could come down and more of us could get access. And I think they changed the perception. I mean, these are like some of the fastest cars, like ordinary cars you could just buy in the world. And so they've really changed the perception of what an electric vehicle can be. It's not just that you're compromising in order to help the environment, but you can get something cool that you actually legitimately love, not only if you're a tree hugger, but also, even if you're not. And so, so I think that did a lot of good. Will they continue to dominate in the future? I don't know. I mean, they're the companies they're up against have a lot of history in making gasoline vehicles, but they're also really big. And so maybe more conservative in making the transition, but we'll just have to see what happens in the coming decade. So
Thank you so much. Well, I know we're a little bit over time, so thank you, Dr. Michalek, for taking time away from your work to give this webinar. The recording to this webinar will be posted on our Region 7 Science Programs webpage. I posted the link in the chat. Our webpage is a one-stop shop to Region 7's research projects, as well as ORD's funding opportunities, webinars, trainings, and publications. And you can click on the link to our webpage or hover your phone over the QR code, and it will take you to the webpage. I also posted the website to the Region 7 Science Program story map in the chat as well. So there's an opportunity to look at some of the more recent research projects that we've done since 2015. So thank you all for attending, and this recording will be saved and I will post it later on the webpage, and the webpage is updated monthly. And so Dr. Michalek, if you're able to share the slides, I will also include the slides to the webinar along with the recording. So thank you very much, everyone, and I appreciate your time and attendance today. Have a nice day.
thanks so much.